The pig family went on vacation to an old house in the middle of the forest. The house creaked with every step, and the trees outside the window didn't move even in the wind. Peppa and George were playing in the nursery. The parents were preparing food in the kitchen. At first, everything was going well, but in the evening, George noticed something outside the window.
"He is already here,"
he whispered. That night, George saw a silhouette of a strange tree through the window. He went outside to look at it. It was a mistake. In the morning, George was gone. Mom cried. Dad turned pale. The police didn't answer, so the parents went into the forest to look for him. They told Peppa not to go anywhere and not to open the door for anyone. Peppa was left alone. The parents walked along a creepy trail and ended up deep in the forest. Suddenly, they came across what had caused the nighttime sounds. A huge tree with arms and legs. Eyes and a creepy smile stood and looked at them. Meanwhile, Peppa was sitting in the living room. Suddenly, the TV turned on by itself. On screen was their forest. The camera slowly zoomed in on something between the trees. It was her parents hanging upside down. Then static and silence. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. Fear gripped Peppa, but staying inside was dangerous. The monster knew where she was. Peppa tried to run through the forest to find help, but it had become denser than during the day. She walked along a trail and suddenly saw it. A creature resembling a tree. Tall, thin, yellow eyes, a huge mouth. It was staring directly at her.
"Peppa, your family has been waiting."
Peppa Pig woke up early in the morning.
George, wake up! It's time for breakfast!
She noticed something strange outside the window. The shadow moved on its own, like a living creature.
Mommy, Daddy, look! There's something out there!
But when everyone turned to look, the shadow had disappeared. The family decided to go to the park. Peppa saw the strange shadow again.
George, do you see that?
But George was too busy digging in the sandbox. Suddenly, George started crying. His beloved Mr. Dinosaur had disappeared. They searched everywhere but couldn't find it.
"Don't cry, George,"
said Daddy Pig.
"We'll buy you a new dinosaur."
In the evening, strange sounds came from the basement.
What's that?
Asked Peppa, pressing close to her mother.
"I'll go check,"
said Daddy Pig. He went down to the basement but returned with nothing. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange noise. And then she saw it. Shadows on the wall moving by themselves, taking frightening forms. Peppa hid under the blanket, trembling with fear. The kitchen was empty. There was only a note on the table. "We're in the basement. Come join us." Together, holding hands, they headed toward the basement. The staircase seemed endless, and the darkness grew thicker. George clutched the new dinosaur they had bought him yesterday. In the basement, they discovered a door that hadn't been there before. A strange greenish light emanated from behind it. Peppa heard her mother's voice calling them to enter. When they entered, they found themselves in a strange room. The walls were curved, furniture was upside down, and colors were unnaturally bright. In the center of the room stood their parents, motionless, and stared at one point. Suddenly, George's new dinosaur toy began to grow and change. It transformed into a real dinosaur. Its eyes glowed red and something dark dripped from its mouth. They ran toward the exit, but the door had disappeared. The walls of the room began to close in, and strange shadows crawled from the corners. At the moment of greatest fear, the real Mr. Dinosaur fell out of George's pocket. As soon as the toy touched the floor, everything around began to crack like glass. Peppa suddenly woke up in her bed, George sleeping peacefully, hugging Mr. Dinosaur. Everything seemed normal until Peppa noticed a strange drawing on the refrigerator, exactly like the shadows she had seen in her dream. The drawing was signed, "From your friend in the basement," and outside the window a dark figure with red eyes briefly appeared, watching the pig family's house. It was an ordinary day. Peppa's math teacher, Madame Gazelle, started coming to her house. At first, Peppa enjoyed studying with her. However, after a few days, Peppa became thin and sad. Her parents started to worry.
"Peppa, you must eat."
Mama Pig insisted, but Peppa didn't want anything except math.
Please, call Madame Gazelle.
Her parents obeyed their daughter's request. Peppa looked worse and worse. Madame Gazelle sat with her in the room and taught her mathematics. Suddenly, she pulled out a pink stone. Peppa's pupils disappeared, and she floated up as if hypnotized.
Math is your life, Peppa,
said Madame Gazelle with a sinister smile. Meanwhile, her parents had no idea what was happening. They were sitting in the living room watching TV.
What an interesting movie,
said Daddy Pig. A few days later, Peppa could no longer walk or talk.
Why isn't she getting better?
Mama Pig asked, wiping tears from her eyes. One day, Mama Pig saw Madame Gazelle smiling menacingly, holding a stone over Peppa.
What is going on here?
Shouted Mama Pig.
Get out of here, Madame Gazelle,
said Daddy Pig, looking at her with suspicion. The room darkened. Madame Gazelle transformed into a terrible monster that only said one thing.
Math will take over the world. Bow to it.
A cold wind blew. Everything around turned into a tornado of notebooks and numbers. In the morning, everyone sat at the table with crazy faces. They were solving problems while Madame Gazelle loomed over them as if controlling their minds. Peppa found a box in the closet. Dusty, old. On it was written, "Our home," in childish handwriting. Inside was a tape, a regular VHS, but their family hadn't owned a player in years. Mummy Pig was surprised. Someone must have mixed it up. Let's throw it away? But Daddy Pig said, "I have an old player in the basement. We can watch." That evening, they all gathered in the living room. The screen flickered. The image shook. On the tape, their house, like someone was standing silently, filming. "Strange," said Mummy Pig. "I don't remember anyone recording us." Then, dinner scene. Everyone sitting at the table. Daddy, Mummy, and Peppa on both sides. Two Peppas, identical, both eating. But one of them smiled. Wrong. Suddenly, one of them turned her head and looked directly into the camera. And in the next instant, she was standing in their room. Peppa and George were playing hide and seek. Just like always, George chose a cozy spot, a little further than usual. Peppa was walking through an empty hall. The house seemed frozen in time. George was hiding well, too well. Mommy Pig was washing the dishes, but her movements were a bit slowed down.
Mommy, George isn't coming out.
He always plays like that.
Peppa felt the presence of something supernatural. The wardrobe where George was hiding was now closer than before. George was always nearby, but he wasn't here. The game of hide and seek had long since crossed into another realm. Peppa approached the window. There was George. He was outside, looking at Peppa and trying to get her attention. Turning around, Peppa noticed that George was also inside. She went outside. The yard was empty. The grass was pressed down, as if someone had just left. But now, in the window, there was her, the one who hadn't come out. Peppa decided to go back home. The door creaked as if someone was pulling it at the same time she did. Something in the house had changed, like it was shrinking. The wardrobe remained, but it no longer hid anything. Peppa entered the kitchen. George sat with his back to her at the table. He was waiting, but something was wrong. His face was blurred. He whispered,
You lose. The game was over.
but had it ever really begun? Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Living Toy. George loved his dinosaur, but that day, the toy fell into a place where it shouldn't have gone. George didn't know. Some toys find their owners on their own. When George disappeared, Peppa decided to look for him, but she had no idea. She would have to search not for her brother, but for what had taken him. The trail led to the nursery, where it all began. The door to the nursery swung open, and Peppa saw a giant dinosaur holding George in its claws.
Give him back!
Peppa shouted, but the dinosaur already knew his name. Peppa tried to rescue her brother, but the dinosaur swatted her away with its tail. George mumbled. His voice sounded strange, as if the dinosaur was learning how to be hidden. Peppa grabbed a toy hammer and struck the dinosaur's paw. It dropped George.
Run!
Peppa yelled, but George didn't move. His eyes turned red. In the morning, George returned, but Peppa saw that now the dinosaur was always watching him. At night, a voice was heard behind the door.
The little dinosaur. Mine.
He waiting, because children can be lost so easily, especially when they think they've been found. George started drawing strange pictures. In each one, a creature with a round head and white eyes, no arms, no legs, just a body. It comes at night, George whispered. I saw it. Peppa didn't believe him, but that night she woke up. And in the corner of her room, something was lying there, a huge round head. It didn't move, but it was breathing. When she turned on the light, it vanished. The next night, her flashlight went out. She heard something crawling under the bed, no footsteps, just a sticky sliding sound. Peppa looked down, and it was there, face inches away, head round, eyes white. In the morning, George's eyes had turned completely gray. He didn't speak. He just stared at Peppa, and then it came again. From the wall, across the ceiling. It stopped right above her, and then the words,
Now you've seen me too.
A bright sunny day, the entire Peppa family was on their way to visit Grandma and Grandpa.
I can't wait to see Grandma and Grandpa.
Said Peppa.
Dinosaur.
Exclaimed George. They enjoyed a cozy time together, baking cookies. Peppa and George exchanged mischievous smiles.
Let's explore the basement.
Suggested Peppa. They tiptoed down the creaky stairs into the dimly lit basement. In the corner stood a dusty chest covered in cobwebs.
What is that? A treasure chest?
Peppa asked in surprise. She opened it with a loud creak. Suddenly, dark shadows burst out from inside, forming sinister figures. Peppa, I'm scared, George said fearfully. At that moment, everything in the kitchen was peaceful and calm. The family was drinking tea when, suddenly, the children's screams prompted the parents to go downstairs.
What's going on, kids?
Asked Mummy Pig. The shadows swirled around the parents, trying to pull them into the chest. Daddy Pig grabbed one of the tentacles that was emerging from the chest.
George, Peppa, back away!
Daddy Pig shouted sternly. But suddenly, one of the shadows struck him, causing him to lose his balance and loosen his grip. The shadows swallowed the parents. Grandma and Grandpa were having a lovely chat in the kitchen, but Grandpa noticed that no one had come back from the basement for a long time and decided to check. Grandpa Pig hurried down the stairs with a serious look on his face.
Inside this chest were the souls of those brave enough to open it. I found this on an old ship,
He said grimly.
It's a curse.
He pulled out an old book from his pocket and began to recite a spell. The shadows taunted Grandpa, whispering incomprehensible words, and he looked frightened.
Grandpa, help us!
Peppa cried out. The shadows started to dissolve, but suddenly George snatched the book from Grandpa's hands and threw it onto the floor. His eyes turned red as if he were under hypnosis. No more light needed, he declared. The remaining shadows lunged at Grandpa, dragging him into the chest. He struggled but was helpless. Peppa watched in horror as George advanced toward her with tears in her eyes.
What are you doing?
She shouted in fear. With tears streaming down her face, she grabbed the tattered book tightly and held it high.
I won't let you take my family!
She declared to the shadows, her voice trembling but resolute. She recited something she remembered from Grandpa's stories. The shadows screamed and began to vanish. Silence fell over the basement. Peppa and George were left alone, trembling with horror as they realized they had lost their family. At that moment, Grandma was enjoying the taste of her tea and listening to pleasant music, but a feeling of unease disturbed her peace. Grandma Pig appeared at the top of the stairs, looking horrified at what was happening. Peppa and George looked at each other, trembling, speechless. From inside the open chest, faint whispers of the shadows still echoed softly. This is a lost episode that was never aired on TV. It all began on a normal day. Peppa lost one of her baby teeth. "Hooray!" she shouted, "Dad. Now the tooth fairy will bring me a gift." Mummy Pig smiled. "Put the tooth under your pillow, dear. There'll be a surprise in the morning." That night, Peppa woke up. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. She heard a crunching sound from under her pillow. When she lifted it, the tooth was gone, but there was no gift either. Only a strange white lump, like it was made of bones. The next day, George complained about a toothache. Then Mummy Pig, then Daddy Pig. They all said, "Maybe we ate something bad." That night, Peppa woke up again, but not from the crunch. This time, from breathing. Someone was sitting by her bed, a figure, gray, far too tall, with long arms and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "Do you brush your teeth well, Peppa?" it whispered. "You give them to me, one by one, every night." Peppa screamed, but no one came. George was asleep with his mouth open. His front teeth were missing. Mummy was standing in the hallway, smiling. On her cheek, a white patch like bone powder. Peppa ran to the mirror. On her face, new teeth were growing, but not hers. A third row, sharp, wrong. She ran back to the bedroom. Everyone's teeth were falling out, more and more every second, and someone stood in the corner. That same figure, but its face. Oh God.